Before glass, a window was just a hole in the wall. Open it, and you could see the world outside. But the world came in with the daylight. Winter cold, summer heat, dust, insects, street noise, and smoke from a neighbor's fire. Close it, and the room surrendered to gloom. For most of human history, seeing out and staying protected were almost opposite wishes. The strange part is that people had known glass for thousands of years before they could make a sheet useful enough to seal a building. The first true window glass was thick, greenish, bubbled, and warped. Nothing like the clear panes we forget are there. The turning point is coming when Rome puts light behind a wall and an ordinary opening begins to change civilization. A pane of glass looks like nothing. That's its trick. It disappears so completely that we forget it is a technology. Melted stone, frozen into a transparent barrier, placed between the human body and the world. But the first people who lived with glass in their windows were not just getting a nicer view. They were getting warmer rooms, brighter interiors, new kinds of architecture, new ideas of privacy, new displays of wealth, and eventually, a world where indoor life could stretch deeper into the day. To understand how radical that was, we have to begin in houses where daylight had a price. Imagine waking before sunrise in a town of mud brick, timber, reed, or stone. The room around you is not dark because people don't understand architecture. It's dark because every opening in the wall is a weakness. A hole lets in light, but it also lets in rain. It lets out smoke, but it lets in cold. It gives you air, but it gives animals, insects, dust, and strangers a way to enter. In a world without window glass, a window is not yet a comfortable frame for a view. It's a controlled wound in the building. So people improvise. They build small openings high in the wall. They cut vents near the roof. They use courtyards, doorways, shutters, curtains, woven mats, wooden screens, thin stone, scraped animal hide, oiled cloth, horn, and in some places paper. These materials do useful things, but they don't do the one miracle glass will eventually do: let daylight pass while making a firm barrier against weather. This is why so many early houses revolve around the courtyard. In ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian domestic architecture, interior courts brought light and air inward without exposing the household directly to the street. In Greek and Roman houses, the atrium and peristyle were not decorative extras. They were part of the lighting system of the home. If the outer walls had too many openings, the house became harder to defend, harder to keep warm, and harder to keep private. And the poor had fewer choices. A wealthy household could afford better joinery, shutters, screens, and lamps. Ordinary people often worked with shadow. A craftsman who needed steady light might move closer to the doorway. A woman spinning thread might sit near the threshold. A shopkeeper might open the front of the shop to the street during the day and close it at night with boards. The wall did not yet contain a transparent boundary. It had to be opened or shut. There is a quiet absurdity here. Humans had built cities, temples, ships, roads, irrigation systems, and empires before most of them had a bright, weatherproof room. They could move stone blocks weighing tons. They could track the stars. They could cast bronze. But on a cold, wet day, if they wanted light inside, they still had to accept a little piece of the outside world coming in with it. That was the problem window glass solved. Not vision alone, not beauty alone. It solved the contradiction between shelter and light. But the solution began somewhere much stranger than a window. It began as a luxury material, small enough to hold in the hand. The earliest glass was not made for windows. It was made for wonder. Archaeological evidence places early true glassmaking in the broad region of Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, with roots reaching back into the 3rd millennium BCE. The first known glass objects were tiny, precious things: beads, inlays, amulets, and decorative pieces that looked almost magical because their color could glow like stone but come from fire. To ancient eyes, glass did not begin as an invisible material. It began as artificial gemstone. Blue glass could echo lapis lazuli. Turquoise glass could resemble prized minerals. Red, yellow, and green glass could turn a small object into something that caught the light with unnatural intensity. This mattered because color itself was wealth. In the Bronze Age, long-distance trade brought rare stones, metals, shells, and pigments across hundreds or thousands of miles. Glass offered a new possibility. Humans could manufacture brilliance. The chemistry was demanding. Glass needs silica, usually from sand or crushed quartz. It needs a flux, something that helps the silica melt at lower temperatures. In the ancient Eastern Mediterranean, natron and plant ash could serve this role. It also needs heat, and not just the ordinary heat of a hearth. It needs furnace technology, controlled fuel, skilled labor, and people who understand how a glowing substance changes as it cools. That is why glass remained expensive. For much of its early history, it was not an everyday household material. It appeared in elite settings, in royal tombs, in ritual objects, in small containers for precious substances, and in decorative inlays. Egyptian and Near Eastern glassmakers used techniques like core forming, building a vessel around a temporary core of clay or sand, then removing the core after the glass cooled. The result could be beautiful, but it was slow, small, and laborious. The important point is this. For roughly 2,000 years, glass was known, admired, traded, and worked. But it was not yet a window. Nobody was filling townhouses with clear panes. Nobody was gazing through broad sheets of transparent glass at the street below. The material existed, but the form was missing. It was too precious, too hard to shape, too small in scale, and often too colored or opaque to serve as a practical window. Then the late Bronze Age world, with its palace economies and trade networks, suffered dramatic disruptions around the end of the second millennium BCE. Many luxury industries changed, contracted, or were reorganized. Glassmaking did not vanish forever, but the long road from jewel-like bead to architectural pane was not a straight march. It was a fragile craft, tied to fuel, trade, furnaces, and elite demand. And for the window, one more revolution was needed. Glass had to stop being only treasure and become a material that could be made in larger quantities. That revolution would come not from architecture first, but from a tube of hot air. For centuries, making a glass vessel meant coaxing a stubborn, glowing material into shape with slow techniques. Then, around the 1st century BCE, probably along the Syro-Palestinian coast, glassblowing appeared. It was one of those inventions that looks simple only after someone has done it. A worker gathers molten glass on the end of a hollow pipe, blows air into it, and the glass swells. A bubble becomes a bottle becomes a cup becomes a commodity. The blowpipe did not invent glass, but it changed the economics of glass. Suddenly, a skilled glassworker could make thinner vessels more quickly, using less material and less finishing labor. In the Roman world, this mattered enormously. Rome had roads, ports, military supply systems, commercial networks, urban markets, and a hunger for useful goods. A faster way to shape glass could spread. By the 1st century CE, glassblowing was helping glass move from elite luxury toward everyday use. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has described the impact clearly. Glassblowing reduced both the glass and labor needed for vessels, helping glass become much more widely available in the Roman world. This is the hidden precondition for window glass. Before you can put glass into architecture, you need a culture that can produce glass in quantity, move it, sell it, and think of it as more than a royal novelty. Roman glass was still varied. Some pieces remained expensive works of art. Mold-blown cups and flasks could carry patterns, inscriptions, or maker's marks. The famous glassworker Ennion, active in the early 1st century CE, signed elegant mold-blown vessels that survive today in museum collections. But the broader shift was bigger than any one artist. Glass was becoming a Roman material, part of the texture of daily life. Bottles, jars, cups, unguentaria, tableware, mosaic tesserae, and eventually panes. But blowing a bottle is not the same as making a window. The earliest Roman window glass was not made by the later medieval crown glass method, and it was not the clear float glass we know today. Early panes were often cast or poured. Molten glass spread into a flat mold or onto a prepared surface, then cooled into a thick sheet. The result transmitted light but distorted vision. It could have ripples, bubbles, rough surfaces, and a greenish or bluish tint from impurities. That sounds primitive until you remember the alternative. A bad pane of glass is still a miracle if the alternative is a hole covered by a shutter. Even a cloudy pane can admit daylight while blocking rain and wind. Even a warped pane can brighten a bathhouse, a villa, or a public building. The first window glass did not need to offer a perfect view. It needed to make interior light possible without surrendering comfort. And as Roman furnaces improved in the mid-1st century CE, that possibility became real. The wall could finally hold a piece of frozen light. The first known widespread use of glass in windows belongs to the Roman world. Not because Romans were the first people to want light indoors, but because they combined several things at once: furnace technology, urban wealth, large building programs, trade networks, and a taste for comfort. By the mid-1st century CE, Roman glassmakers could produce molten glass in ways that made architectural panes practical for high-status buildings. Try to picture one of these early panes. It is not a modern rectangle from a hardware store. It is thick enough to feel almost like a slab. It may be uneven at the edges. One face might be smoother than the other. It carries the memory of the mold, the furnace, the cooling process, and the worker's hand. Looking through it, you might not see a sharp street scene. You might see softened shapes, light, color, movement. But if you are inside a heated room, that is enough. Roman builders used window glass where it gave the most benefit: baths, villas, elite houses, and some public buildings. Baths are especially important because they reveal the practical logic. A bathhouse needs heat, steam, light, and controlled air. Open windows waste heat. Closed shutters create darkness. Glass lets sunlight in while helping hold warmth. In the Roman imagination, comfort was not a minor luxury. Bathing was social, architectural, and civic. A bright heated bathing room could show off both engineering and refinement. Pompeii gives us a frozen glimpse. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it buried buildings, objects, wall paintings, shops, bodies, and daily life under volcanic material. Among the city's preserved structures were the suburban baths near the Porta Marina. These baths had large glass windows before the eruption. That single fact is astonishing. Less than a century after glassblowing began transforming production, a Roman town on the Bay of Naples already had a public bathing complex using large panes to manage light and heat. This doesn't mean every Roman apartment had glazed windows. Far from it. Window glass was still associated with expense and status. Many openings still used shutters, curtains, grills, or nothing at all. But the concept had crossed a threshold. A window could be transparent, protective, and architectural. A wall could admit daylight without being opened. There is another Roman detail that matters. Glass was often used alongside other inventions of comfort: hypercaust heating, aqueduct-fed baths, urban water systems, paved streets, and complex masonry. Window glass belongs to that family. It is not a lonely object. It is part of a civilization, learning to engineer indoor environments. And that is where the story becomes bigger than a pane. Once people learn that a building can separate climate from light, architecture begins to dream differently. Modern people often think the purpose of a window is the view. We imagine looking out at a garden, a street, a skyline, or the rain sliding down the glass. But for the first users of window glass, the view was secondary. The real prize was light without exposure. Early window glass was too imperfect to behave like an invisible membrane. It bent the scene behind it. It blurred lines. It made the outside shimmer. In some panes, bubbles trapped in the glass would catch the sun like tiny fossils of the furnace. The glass might be more translucent than transparent. It told you the day was bright. It did not always show you the face of the person passing outside. That changed how buildings could function. Workshops could keep working in worse weather. Baths could stay warm and lit. Wealthy rooms could become more comfortable. Storage spaces, corridors, and upper chambers could receive daylight without leaving goods exposed. In colder climates, the importance would become even greater. A shutter is honest but brutal. Open for light, shut for protection. Glass introduces a third state. There is something psychologically powerful about that third state. It allows people to be indoors and still connected to the cycle of the day. It lets the sky enter a room. It lets architecture collect daylight like a resource. For a city, that matters. Lamps were expensive to fuel. Fire carried risk, Smoke irritated eyes and darkened surfaces. A bright room was not just pleasant, it was safer and more productive. But window glass also created a new kind of inequality. Light itself became a visible mark of status. If your house had glazed openings and mine had shutters, your interior could be brighter, warmer, and more impressive. Your wall could display technological access. Mine could only open and close. Even before glass became common, it was a social signal. Roman writers and later archaeological finds make clear that glass could range from humble to luxurious. It was not one thing, it was a material hierarchy. A small utilitarian bottle and an elite cut glass vessel lived in the same technological universe, but not the same social one. Window glass entered that hierarchy too. The people who first enjoyed it were not the poorest tenants in the darkest rooms. They were institutions and households with means. So the first window glass did not democratize light overnight. It revealed the possibility of controlled daylight, then let wealth claim it first. That pattern will repeat across history. A new object appears as luxury, then slowly becomes ordinary, until later generations forget it was ever rare. But after Rome, that future was not guaranteed. The empire that carried window glass across provinces would fracture, and the pane in the wall would have to survive centuries of upheaval. The fall of Roman political power in the West did not erase glassmaking, but it changed the conditions that had made large-scale Roman production possible. Trade routes shifted, cities contracted, building habits changed, skilled crafts continued in many places, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean and later in Islamic and Byzantine contexts. But in much of early medieval Europe, window glass was no longer a normal expectation for ordinary domestic life. This is one of the most important corrections to the easy story of invention. An object can be invented and still not become universal. A society can know a technology and still use it rarely. Window glass existed, but fuel, furnaces, stable demand, transport, wealth, and building traditions determined where it appeared. In churches and monasteries, glass found a powerful refuge. Christian architecture valued controlled light, symbolism, color, and the transformation of interior space. A church window did not just keep out weather, it could teach, glow, and produce atmosphere. By the early medieval period, glass windows appeared in important religious buildings, though they were often small, expensive, and assembled from pieces rather than large clear sheets. Stained glass would later become one of the great art forms of Europe, but its rise also tells us something practical. When you cannot easily make a huge clear pane, you can build a window out of many smaller pieces held in lead. Color is not merely decoration, it is also a way to make small glass pieces meaningful. A limitation becomes an art. In domestic buildings, many people still relied on shutters, wooden lattices, cloth, parchment, horn, or simply small openings. In England, panes of flattened animal horn were used in the medieval period. Thin translucent stone, like alabaster or mica in some regions, could admit a ghostly light. Paper served as an economical window material in parts of East Asia. These alternatives mattered, and they show that people never stopped chasing the same problem: how to bring daylight inside without bringing the weather with it. But each substitute had trade-offs. Horn could be translucent, but not truly clear. Cloth and parchment could be damaged by damp. Paper diffused light, but could not provide the same durability or resistance. Shutters remained useful, but they forced the old choice between open and closed. Glass was still the most magical answer, but often the least accessible. The surprising thing is that this scarcity helped shape medieval interiors. Rooms were darker, openings were smaller, hearths and candles did more work. Social life gathered around light sources: the doorway, the fire, the courtyard, the hall. The built environment taught people to live by patches of brightness. Then, over centuries, European glassmakers developed methods that would slowly pull the pane out of churches and elite houses and toward ordinary walls. The next turning point looked like a spinning disk of light. Medieval and early modern glassmakers did not have one single method for window glass. They had a family of methods, each with its own compromises. One famous technique was crown glass. A glassworker blew a bubble, opened it, reheated it, and spun it until centrifugal force flattened it into a disc. From that disc, small panes could be cut. The center, where the rod had been attached, left a thick circular lump called a bullseye. Those bullseye panes still survive in historic buildings, and they are a clue to the object's handmade past. They remind us that a window was once assembled from pieces born from breath, heat, rotation, and risk. The glass was not poured by an invisible machine. It was performed. Another method, cylinder glass, involved blowing glass into a long cylinder, cutting it open, and flattening it into a sheet. This could produce larger panes than crown glass, though still with waves, marks, and irregularities. Over time, glassmakers refined these techniques, especially in regions with strong craft traditions and access to fuel and raw materials. Forest glasshouses appeared, where wood could feed furnaces. Venetian and later Northern European glassmakers became famous for specialized skills. The story of windows is also a story of forests, sand, ash, trade, and heat. The medieval church window pushed the craft toward complexity. Gothic architecture, rising from the 12th century onward, made walls thinner and openings larger. Stone tracery divided those openings into shapes that could hold glass. Cathedrals like Chartres used stained glass not as an afterthought, but as part of the spiritual and architectural experience. Light became colored narrative. Walls seemed to dissolve into story, but for ordinary houses, progress was slow. Glass remained costly enough that windows were sometimes treated almost like movable property. In some places and periods, glazed frames could be removed when a household moved. The window was valuable enough to travel. That sounds strange now, because modern glass is cheap, standardized, and forgettable. But if each pane represents skilled labor, furnace fuel, transport, and breakage risk, it makes sense. A glazed window was not just a hole in a house. It was capital installed in a wall. This is where glass begins to reshape domestic life more visibly. As glazing spread among the wealthy, and then the middling classes, rooms became more usable during the day. Interiors could display furniture, books, textiles, tools, and status. Shopfronts could show goods behind a barrier. The relationship between inside and outside became more sophisticated. A person could look out while remaining protected. A merchant could display without fully exposing. A household could signal respectability through brightness. Still, the pane was small, uneven, and expensive. The dream of the large, clear window was waiting for more than craft. It needed industry. By the early modern period, window glass had become common enough in parts of Europe to matter socially, but not cheap enough to be invisible. That uncomfortable middle stage produced one of the strangest chapters in the history of daylight, the window tax. In England, a tax on windows was introduced in 1696. The logic was political and practical. Windows were visible from the street, so they were easier to count than income hidden in ledgers. More windows usually meant a larger, wealthier house. In theory, the tax reached wealth without invading private finances. In practice, it turned daylight into something the state could price. The result is still visible on old buildings. Bricked-up windows. Some were blocked to reduce tax burdens. Others may have been part of design changes, but the association became famous because it captures the absurdity so perfectly. A technology invented to bring light inside became a taxable sign of wealth, and people responded by walling the light back out. This is the dark reveal in the story of window glass. The object that solved the ancient bargain between shelter and daylight created a new bargain between comfort and cost. If you could afford glass, you could afford brightness. If glass made your house appear prosperous, it could also make your house financially exposed. The phrase daylight robbery is often linked in popular imagination to this tax, though the exact origin of the phrase is debated and shouldn't be treated as certain. What is certain is the policy itself and the architectural response it helped encourage. Windows could become records of taxation, inequality, and adaptation. This was not only an English story. Across Europe, glass windows marked class. In cities, the ability to display goods behind glass transformed commerce. Shops could tempt customers even when the door was closed. Objects could be seen but not touched. Desire could be staged. The window became a boundary not only between weather and shelter, but between possession and longing. In homes, more glass changed manners. It altered privacy. It made interiors more visible from outside, especially at night when lamps turned rooms into little theaters. Curtains, blinds, and shutters remained important because transparency created its own problem. The same pane that let a family look out could let neighbors look in. So window glass did not simply create openness, it created a managed openness. Look, but not too much. Display, but protect. Admit light, then cover the light when privacy matters. This tension is still with us every evening when people close curtains in rooms surrounded by glass. By the 18th century, however, another pressure was building. Architects, scientists, gardeners, shopkeepers, and manufacturers wanted bigger, clearer panes. The old handmade methods could not satisfy the future. The next stage required glass to become industrial. The industrial age changed window glass by attacking its oldest enemies: size, cost, and distortion. For centuries, the handmade pane carried visible traces of its birth. It wavered, it thickened, it held bubbles. That could be charming in a cottage window, but it was a problem for science, industry, greenhouses, shop fronts, rail stations, and modern architecture. One important step was plate glass. In the late 17th century, French glassmakers developed improved methods of casting and polishing large plates. The name often associated with this advance is Bernard Perrault, who worked on cast plate glass, and Louis Lucas de Nehu, connected with Royal French glass production in the era of Louis XIV. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, completed in the late 17th century, displayed the political meaning of glass as spectacle. Mirrors are not windows, but the same pursuit of large, flat, polished glass mattered deeply for both reflection and transparency. Plate glass was expensive because it had to be cast, ground, and polished, but it pointed toward a new ideal: glass that was large, flat, and optically controlled. That ideal would feed shop windows, carriage windows, scientific instruments, and later the glass skins of cities. In the 19th century, industrial production expanded. In Britain, Chance Brothers became a major manufacturer of window glass, lighthouse lenses, and other glass products. The Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, made glass architecture into a public spectacle. Designed by Joseph Paxton, it used iron and glass on a scale that stunned visitors. It was not the first glass building, but it showed a mass audience what industrial glazing could do: create a vast interior flooded with daylight. The Crystal Palace matters because it turns window glass from a domestic convenience into an environmental system. A building could be almost all enclosure and light. Plants, people, machinery, and exhibits could share a controlled interior under transparent surfaces. The ancient problem had been a small hole in a wall. The industrial answer was an entire palace of glass, but industry brought costs of its own. Glassmaking consumed fuel. It demanded labor under intense heat. It tied architecture to extraction, transport, and factory discipline. The clear pane in a city window carries hidden histories of furnaces, mines, forests, chemical works, and workers whose names rarely survive. The 19th century also changed streets. Larger shop windows helped create modern consumer culture. Department stores and arcades used glass to turn browsing into an urban pastime. Goods no longer waited inside darkness. They glowed behind transparent barriers. A city street became a corridor of illuminated desire. And yet even industrial glass was still not the final form. The smooth, nearly invisible pane in most modern windows required one more breakthrough: a way to make flat glass continuously, cheaply, and with extraordinary consistency. It arrived in the 20th century, and it changed the skyline. The glass in most modern windows owes a great deal to the float glass process, developed in the 1950s by Alistair Pilkington and his team at Pilkington Brothers in Britain. The principle is elegant. Molten glass floats on a bath of molten tin. Because the surface is level naturally, the glass emerges flat and smooth, without the laborious grinding and polishing that older plate glass required. This was not a small refinement. It was a manufacturing revolution. Float glass made high-quality flat glass cheaper, more consistent, and more scalable. It helped create the modern window as we know it: large, clear, standardized, and ordinary. Office towers, picture windows, glass doors, vehicle windows, display cases, and countless household panes depend on this industrial logic. The psychological effect is easy to miss because we live inside it. Modern glass makes the boundary between inside and outside feel negotiable. A living room can open visually onto a yard while remaining heated. A skyscraper can give workers a view from hundreds of feet above the street. A museum can protect an artifact while letting us inspect it. A storefront can sell after closing by keeping its goods visible. A school, hospital, factory, or airport can use daylight as part of its design. But the clearer the glass became, the more complicated its role became. Modern cities use glass to symbolize openness, but glass can also conceal power. A mirrored tower may reflect the sky while hiding the people inside. A transparent lobby can look public while remaining controlled by cameras, guards, and access cards. Glass promises visibility, but it doesn't always promise equality. There are also environmental consequences. A glass wall admits light, but it can also admit heat. In cold weather, poorly insulated glass loses warmth. In hot climates, large windows can increase cooling demands. Modern glazing has responded with double panes, coatings, laminated layers, tempered safety glass, insulated units, and smart glass technologies. The story did not end when glass became clear. It became a new engineering problem: how to keep the miracle of daylight without paying too high a cost in energy, safety, or comfort. This returns us to the ancient bargain. The first open window forced people to choose between light and protection. Roman glass softened that choice. Industrial glass expanded it. Modern glass almost erased it, then revealed new versions of the same dilemma. How much outside do we want inside? How much transparency is comfort, and how much is exposure? How much daylight can a building welcome before the climate pushes back? A pane of float glass looks like absence. In reality, it is the result of 5,000 years of material experiment. Bead makers, furnace workers, Roman builders, medieval glaziers, tax collectors, industrial manufacturers, and modern engineers, all hidden in a surface you clean with a cloth. The deepest change window glass made was not architectural. It was temporal. It changed how the day could be used. Before reliable glazing, daylight indoors was uneven and conditional. You organized work around doorways, courtyards, fires, lamps, and seasons. Winter narrowed the usable day. Bad weather could drive people into dim rooms. Tasks requiring fine vision competed with cold air and smoke. Glass did not eliminate night, but it stretched the usefulness of daylight inside shelter. That shift touched nearly everything. Reading became easier in more rooms. Writing could move closer to the desk and away from the doorway. Needlework, accounting, drawing, repairing, teaching, and examining objects all benefited from steadier natural light. The rise of glass windows intersects with the rise of interiors as places of specialized activity. Studies, workshops, laboratories, shops, classrooms, offices. Science, too, depends on controlled seeing. The history of glass includes lenses, mirrors, prisms, flasks, and instruments, but window glass belongs to the same cultural movement, the belief that transparent material can mediate knowledge. A pane lets you observe without entering. A lens lets you see what the eye cannot. A vessel lets you contain and inspect. Glass becomes the material of the measured world. In homes, windows changed emotion. A bright room feels different from a dark one. A view changes isolation. Weather becomes spectacle instead of intrusion. Rain on glass is no longer just a leak risk. It becomes something watched. Snow can be seen from warmth. Morning light can wake a room without opening it. These may sound like small comforts, but civilization is built from small comforts that become expectations. Window glass also changed childhood. A child behind a window can watch the street before entering it. An elderly person can remain connected to public life from inside. A sick person can see daylight while protected from cold. A worker in a shop can read the weather and the flow of customers without standing outside. The pane creates a soft boundary, and soft boundaries are powerful. At the same time, glass sharpened the divide between private and public life. The window is a promise and a threat. It invites light, but it invites looking. That is why curtains, shutters, blinds, frosted panes, stained panes, and reflective coatings are not accessories. They are part of the window's social technology. Once you make a wall transparent, you need new rules for when transparency ends. So the first window glass did not simply make buildings brighter, it reorganized attention. It taught humans to inhabit two places at once, inside the room and visually outside it. That double life is now so normal that we barely notice the object making it possible. If you stand before a fragment of Roman window glass in a museum, it can be underwhelming at first. It may look greenish, cloudy, scratched, or uneven. It may not have the jewel-like drama of a glass cup or the grandeur of stained glass. But that fragment is one of the most radical objects in architectural history. It proves that someone, nearly 2,000 years ago, wanted what you wanted this morning: light without discomfort. It proves that a Roman builder, owner, or bath designer thought daylight could be engineered. It proves that a furnace worker could transform sand, flux, heat, and skill into a boundary that changed the experience of a room. Archaeology makes this real. Pompeii's preservation lets us see how glass belonged to daily infrastructure, not just museum luxury. Roman sites across the empire have yielded glass vessels, mosaic pieces, and window fragments, showing a material culture that was practical as well as beautiful. The suburban baths are especially vivid because they join glass to water, steam, heat, architecture, and public life. A pane in a bathhouse is not a decorative trinket. It is part of an environmental machine, and yet the object remains humble. No single inventor's name survives for the first window pane. There is no heroic moment where one person lifts a perfect sheet into the sun and announces the future. The history of window glass is more collective and more human than that. It belongs to anonymous furnace tenders, traders hauling raw glass, builders cutting wall openings, glaziers fitting awkward pieces into frames, and households learning to live with a new kind of light. That anonymity is fitting. Window glass works by disappearing. The better it gets, the less we see it. The first panes were visible because they distorted the world. Modern panes are successful because they almost vanish. But disappearance can make us ungrateful. It can make a miracle seem like air. Look closely, and the pane is not empty. It contains ancient beadmakers in Egypt and Mesopotamia. It contains Roman furnace innovation in the 1st century CE. It contains Pompeii under ash in 79 CE. It contains medieval churches glowing with assembled color. It contains bricked-up windows from attacks that made daylight countable. It contains the Crystal Palace and the industrial dream of transparent space. It contains molten tin under floating glass in a 20th century factory. All of that history is in the ordinary rectangle beside your desk. The first window glass did not just let people see out. It let civilization imagine an inside that did not have to be dark. The secret history of window glass is the story of a human wish so ordinary that we almost never name it: to be sheltered and still receive the sky. Before glass, people solved that wish with courtyards, shutters, screens, horn, cloth, paper, stone, and firelight. They built around the limits of darkness. Then glass moved from bead to vessel, from luxury to Roman commodity, from bathhouse pane to cathedral color, from tax status symbol to industrial sheet, from handmade distortion to float glass clarity. Each step made the boundary between indoors and outdoors more flexible. The first window glass did not arrive as a perfect view. It arrived as cloudy protection. It was expensive, imperfect, and unevenly distributed. But even in that rough form, it changed what a room could be. It made daylight an architectural material. It let heat stay in while brightness entered. It turned walls from barriers into filters. Today, a window is so familiar that we treat it as background. But every pane is a quiet answer to an ancient problem. It is melted earth made transparent. It is a weatherproof piece of daylight. And once humans learned to put that in a wall, the indoor world was never the same. Next time you look through a window, ask yourself what part of your day would disappear if that glass were only a wooden shutter. If this made an ordinary object feel a little less ordinary, subscribe to the Object Chronicles.